Hello, my name is Nicholas Morgan, and this is Turkey Abroad. Today, joining me from Monterey, California, is my guest, Dr. Ryan Gingeris, who's an associate professor at the Naval Postgraduate School and an expert on Turkey. Ryan, how are you?
Very good, thank you.
So today we're talking about a topic that's getting a lot of interest in Turkey circles, and that is Mavi Vatan, or Blue Homeland. So Ryan, I want to start by asking you, where does the idea of Blue Homeland fall along the spectrum of ideas that are often used sometimes to try to explain Turkish foreign policy, like neo-Ottomanism in some cases, or Eurasianism? What is Blue Homeland, and what role does it play in Turkish foreign policy?
Well, I think number one, it should be bear in mind that it's a relatively new concept. I think it's also one should bear in mind that it's one that was arguably contrived from within the Turkish government. Within a decade or more ago. It's the origins of it are not 100% clear, but it has been, one that has been bandied about within Turkish government circles, as far as we know, for a bit of time, and that it's gained greater exposure in the last 2 to 3 years. From the perspective of the, advocates and, from the reputed sort of designer of the concept, it's meant as something more than a kind of slogan or catchphrase aimed at Turkish interests or sort of defining Turkish interests. It's in some ways an attempt to reshape the ways in which Turkish citizens think about maritime politics, think about themselves in the context of history, specifically naval history, and to mobilize citizens in, not only citizens, but it should be, security, sort of Turkish security establishment, people with, who are a part of the Turkish government, to take maritime issues not only more seriously, but to be aggressive in securing, what is argued to be, Turkey's most fundamental interests within its immediate, immediate abroad within, within the Black Sea, the Aegean, and the Mediterranean.
Speaking of the reputed founder of this theory, retired Rear Admiral Cem Gurdanis. He's a bit of an interesting character. You've written on War on the Rocks about him before, and I just find it surprising that someone who is a retired naval officer, who by many measures was a bit of a Kemalist, and then also convicted and arrested during the sledgehammer trials, or the Ergenekon trials, suddenly rose to prominence to be something of an intellectual force in some respects within President Erdogan's Turkey. So how did that evolution happen for him? How did his ideas begin to take root inside the present day Turkey?
Sure. I mean, in a lot of ways, what we know most about him is from his own account of sort of his emergence, especially since 2016. I think the short version of the story is essentially, he established a reputation within the Turkish Navy during his time as essentially the head of security of strategy and planning, the strategy and planning division of the Turkish Navy. What we would say in American circles call sort of like N3, N5, N6. So this broader basket of, how does the Navy go about, thinking about strategy, war planning, priorities within the maritime domain. Now, it's during this period of time, which was sort of around, sort of 2010, 2011, is when he began to sort of, this idea of the Blue Homeland began to crystallize. And it's at this time that he's arrested in the sledgehammer trials. Now, it should be said, up front that, these were, this was very much a politicized investigation, one in which the evidence against much of the accused were highly circumstantial, in fact, most likely fraudulent. And he, along many other senior officers, including a number of flag officers, were convicted. Now, he did serve some time, and he was eventually released on government orders and absolved of any wrongdoing. But I mean, this did not necessarily dull any of his animosity, and bitterness from this investigation. In fact, it's very much a part of the ways in which he actually even frames Blue Homeland. And the short of that is that he sees the world as essentially now shifting in political weight, and that it is shifting more towards the powers of Greater Asia, in which he would sort of place Turkey, and that this is in direct contention with the West. And he essentially blames the United States and all European powers for not only sort of attempting to undermine Turkey's emergence within this new world, but specifically for his prosecution in the sledgehammer trials, and basically alleges this grand conspiracy in which Gulenists throughout the West persecuted him and others like him. Ideologically, he is somewhat coy in the way in which he actually frames himself. He does call himself a Kemalist, but in many ways, he, talks and, behaves much like what, people would consider Eurasianists, people who have, really quite antithetical views about, Western European politics, but also, in American politics, but also culture, see it as fundamentally antagonistic and geared towards undermining Turkish sovereignty, and that Turkey's true friends lay in the East. And that in some ways culturally also, that it's, rooted within sort of the broader framework of Turkic culture, Turkic history on the Eurasian landmass. And so in short, this is, very clearly a part of his political orientation, even though he doesn't necessarily come out and directly sort of say as much. And that this places him in a kind of a unique company among what seems like to be a fair number of flag officers, specifically former flag officers from the Turkish Navy.
It strikes me as a bit of a marriage of convenience in some ways between individuals such as Gurdanis and others, the flag officers who adhere to this Eurasianist sort of worldview. Because to my knowledge, he's not the only one who was caught up in some of the sledgehammer investigations and then now has experienced something of a quiet or informal rehabilitation within Erdogan's Turkey, where they might be opposed on maybe ideological grounds with the ruling AK party, but the belief that in Turkish nationalism and achieving Turkey's core interests, that seems to be the glue that brings them back together. How accurate would you say that understanding is?
I mean, I think, within, Turkey today, there is a really broad consensus on matters of foreign policy. And I think this stretches across not only sort of the factions that are arguably a part of, the ruling government, but also even into the opposition, save maybe the HDP. And I think, it can be boiled down to this. Number one, it's generally agreed that Turkey possesses a great deal of potential as an emerging power in this very moment. I think that it's broadly agreed that this is something within Turkey's right, and that this is a part of, it's, sort of seen as a part of its grander history of, or promise, as a state. It should be a much more influential actor in the global arena. I think there is broad consensus within the Turkish political establishment that there are very clear obstacles, when it comes to realizing this potential. Among them is Greece and the Republic of Cyprus. And perhaps, I would say also sort of the broader Western consensus, and probably best embodied by the United States. And that, Turkey should be more forceful in asserting itself in matters that are most important to us, which would be, again, things like Syria, the threat of Kurdish terrorism, the issue of Azerbaijan and its support for Azerbaijan in the Karabakh, and then lastly, with respect to the Aegean and the Mediterranean, encountering what's believed to be Greek claims. So, I mean, I would not necessarily say that this is a Kemalist consensus. I wouldn't necessarily say, this is somehow, kind of solely within the domain of the Turkish right. I think this is really quite, it's quite broad. It's quite a broad base. And, but what I've argued is that among the things that help kind of keep that base together is that there is a kind of common frame of reference, and that is, in many ways, the ideology of Kemalism, which all these various factions within the Turkish political spectrum believe in or embrace to one degree or another.
So, a big part of Blue Homeland, of course, is involves having access to certain maritime resources and a big engagement in some of the maritime politics, like we're seeing in the East Mediterranean. And to achieve a lot of these goals, it does seem that Turkey would require a much more bolstered navy to meet these needs. And I think very, very often when we think about Turkey's military forces and capabilities, the immediate things that come to mind are its investment in drones, or the Turkish army's actions in Syria, or the use of proxies in Libya. But I want to ask you, how is Turkey bolstering its navy now to achieve some of these stated objectives that they have?
I think, there is certainly a program that's been underway, actually, since the late 90s, geared towards modernizing the Turkish Navy. The nature of this program has changed quite a bit in the last decade or so. And, right now, I mean, the full extent of this modernization effort, is only partially complete. Now, again, the sort of short of it is, it's clear that, what Ankara intends to do is to build a navy that is potentially, has potential as a so-called blue water navy, one that would be able to operate, much further from the Turkish coastline. But more than anything, one that would be able to sustain a naval campaign or an amphibious operation across the whole of the Mediterranean without relying too much on Turkish land forces or the Turkish Air Force. At this point, I mean, we only have seen sort of the first iterations of it, a handful of corvettes, one landing craft, and sort of what should be, it's not entirely clear when it's going to be christened, but also a light carrier. This is going to be augmented supposedly within the next 5 to 10 years with a series of cruisers, including guided missile cruisers. And among, as well as, I shouldn't forget to mention, also a kind of a revamped submarine corps. All of this is is said to be, being produced with mostly local parts, or sort of local, or armed with locally produced munitions. And this has actually been an aspiration of the Turkish military and the Turkish security industry for, more than a quarter of a century, going back to 1974, when Turkey faced an arms embargo as a result of the invasion of Cyprus. And that, this is not only sort of meant as, a means to augment the Navy, but really help sustain military operations without fearing embargoes on essential materials. Now, I mean, I should perhaps say that most of this Navy, as I've just described, only exists on paper. It hasn't been actually actualized yet. It's not entirely clear how they intend to field all of these different, these new platforms. And it's also not entirely clear how effective they're going to be. The one sort of unique issue here is the issue of the light carrier, which it has been proposed that this would have been a platform for the deployment of F-35s. That's not going to be the case anymore, and it's not entirely clear what will replace the F-35 on this light carrier or light carriers. There's the prospect of there being two, perhaps drones. But it's not entirely clear. And I should sort of add, sort of parenthetically here, that the development of this, of this program is still sort of playing out somewhat nebulously. We don't really sort of know a lot about its ultimate trajectory or even the timeline. All we sort of know is based via press reporting and sort of government releases, and a lot of that, needless to say, is not all that reliable.
And of course, building a navy is not cheap, and the Turkish economy has been struggling for years now. And of course, COVID-19 is doing its damage to Turkey, as it's doing to many economies all over the world. So, do you think that this high costs and the weak economy is going to tamper down in any way some of Turkey's ambitions when it comes to pursuing these goals under the Blue Homeland?
I don't know. That's my honest answer. I don't know. I don't. I leave it to others to sort of say how this, the current economic situation will affect Turkish spending or its sort of ability to sustain these programs. Certainly, a lot of these programs have defied gravity in financial terms, given the sort of, the worsening rate of inflation that we see right now. But again, I think in part, this may be the fact that, by relying on locally produced material, it does offset costs to some degree. However, I think one thing that is often overlooked is that, while, the media plays up the fact that most of the, these new platforms are produced locally, a significant part of them aren't. And that, how that plays a role, these sorts of foreign-made parts and, foreign-made munitions play a role in Turkey's planning, it's still hard to say.
I feel that it's also accurate to say that Blue Homeland sort of entered into many minds because of the situation going on in the East Mediterranean, where Turkey's locked into disputes with Greece and the Republic of Cyprus, and that's where a lot of the attention has originated to the Blue Homeland. And of course, there was the maritime deal in Libya too. But does this doctrine extend to explaining any of Turkey's other actions, say in the South Caucasus, the Black Sea, or even its interactions with other countries in the Middle East, like those in the Gulf that it competes with?
It's a good question. Certainly, individuals like Cem Gurdeniz would have us believe so, and that they're all sort of interconnected in some way. But the truth of the matter is, I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily the case. It should be said, up front that, this Turkish strategic thinking is still somewhat opaque. So, we shouldn't necessarily take, the word of former, flag officers as being, kind of definitive evidence of the ways in which, people are thinking within the Turkish government right now. It's just not that clear.
Okay, and I have one final question, and it's the possible impact this Blue Homeland doctrine has had can have on relations with the West or within NATO, given the kind of issues Turkey has right now with, say, the United States over the S-400, or Greece and Cyprus over the East Mediterranean. And I wanted to ask if you think that many analysts or policymakers, those involved in Turkey, if they're paying the right amount of attention to understanding this concept and the role it plays in Turkish foreign policy.
I mean, I should say that, the opinions I'm expressing here, frankly, are mine. They don't reflect anything like official, statements. So, I mean, I can't answer this with complete confidence. I think, given press reporting and given the fact that Turkish behavior in general has been prioritized, let's just say, within, say, NATO, within, American responses, to, issues within the Mediterranean, it's certainly getting attention. I'm not necessarily sure what kind of attention it should get. I think, this issue, it seems to me, within both Europe and the United States, is being framed not simply within the narrow confines of Mediterranean or Aegean security, but within the broader sort of challenge of trying to find some sort of new way of negotiating or interacting with Turkey. And that's there's a lot of different issues that are tangentially connected to the Mediterranean and the Aegean that are also sort of a part of the focus of the United States and Europe as well, whether it's, issues related to Syria or issues related to Russia, or sort of, let's just say, things like, the refugee crisis. All these sorts of things are kind of thrown in to sort of how I think, analysts and policymakers are going about, dealing with Turkey. So this is certainly a part of it. I would imagine that, most people within authoritative circles are, certainly considering it, but it's not being taken in isolation, I would say.
All right. Well, Dr. Ryan Gingeris, it was a pleasure to have you on Turkey Abroad, and I really look forward to speaking to you again on another podcast episode. And I really do appreciate your thoughts on Blue Homeland today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
It's my pleasure. My name is Nicholas Morgan, and this is Turkey Abroad.